Okay, so like slightly different topic. So I've wrote this State of the Media report 2027. Now with Google, ever since they launched AI overviews, they basically decimated like organic like search traffic because a lot of people are just satisfied with AI overviews, even though like they're extremely bad at this point, just because it's like a very cheap and a very fast model, and it leads very little to the actual news publishers. Because of this, we now have this two-tier structure. We have the big media publications, again, like the New York Times, Bloomberg, WSJ. They have the brands, they have recognition, and that enables them to basically sell a lot of very expensive subscriptions to a lot of people. And so they still have sort of like the capital to both employ writers, but also just like continue growing. And I mean, New York Times is like it's a financial juggernaut at this point, really. And yeah, like at the very low end, we have all these like individual like creators who are now essentially rebuilding the media publications that they now left. It's like Eric Newcomer, who like started his own Substack, and now he's hired a bunch of like people, and like he's running events. And like it's a very classic playbook, but he's doing it with like a very different cost structure, and he's able to capture all the upside. The problem is the middle. It's sort of like where a lot of these traditional tech publications, from like the Verge to TechCrunch or like maybe like VentureBeat, they don't yet have the brand or the necessary amount of media subscriptions to produce great content, but they also still have like pretty big like cost structure. They're still struggling. They're trying to adapt. Like a lot of them are launching their own sort of like newsletter for their writers. Part of the problem is that if they create a media personality inside them, they basically give this person a permission to launch their own Substack next, even if they're like they don't have the audience, but just like any kind of like social following would be they would be able to port there. Some of the best writers are now able to go out there on their own and not just maybe like become a writer, but partner with the media publications like Joanna Stern, a very famous like writer and reporter, and she launched her own
That's the one I was
publication.
gonna
Yeah.
talk about.
Yeah.
She announced like a week or two ago that she's doing her own thing, but under the umbrella of what
NBC News, yeah. So yeah, it's like literally a giant news organization partnering with a creator for like a very specific kind of like niche audience and the content they can produce. And I'm sure she's able to capture a lot more value this way compared to just being
Oh,
a regular
definitely.
writer.
It's probably more interesting for the journalists themselves as well, right? Like where you're kind of still doing your own thing, you're your own business. You don't have somebody telling you what you have to write about or having legal that will help you in case anything bad happens, right? They have editors that will edit your pieces and you don't have to do that yourself. So there's like aspects of the business that make it, attractive to kind of partner with these larger media organizations. But then the flip side is you're bringing the audience that you've already built. So it seems like a
Hmm.
win-win for both sides. And it wouldn't surprise me to start seeing that happen more and more, especially for the creators that have built up their own audience off, off platform. But yeah, would love to also, switch over to talk about how are you thinking about how you approach, reaching out and pitching to, journalists, whether, the legacy media or, using one of these newer media startups like, Lenny and Newcomer or TBP and upstarts.
Yeah, I feel like the unfortunate truth is that it's just gotten a lot more like complicated and just generally way harder than it was before across the entire spectrum, like The Verge to like TechCrunch. I feel like they've they've raised their bar quite a lot. Like if like maybe like like 5 years ago, if you had like a pretty like sizable like funding rounds, like I guess maybe like starting from like 5 million, and if you have like a generally good story, the chances of getting there are pretty high. I wouldn't say this is the truth today. Like first of all, yeah, they need to have at least something, but they care a lot more about the story, about what's interesting about your company, about like the founders, like if they have any like pedigree behind them. And then there are like these smaller like creator publications, they are like their bar I feel like is even higher just because they care a lot more about who their guests and who their profiles are. And getting into like one of these publications is probably even more difficult than getting into like, again, TechCrunch or maybe Business Insider right now. So it's definitely like a very difficult time for startups. And it's not like, again, I'm not saying the legacy media is dead. Of course, they're very much alive, especially at the top end. I mean, just a couple of hours ago, Whoop announced their funding round with a New York Times exclusive. And they've been sort of like cited across a whole a series of other media publications publications. And yeah, they didn't just post a tweet.
Yeah,
There's a reason
yeah,
why they do this,
yeah.
especially as they're preparing for an IPO. I imagine, like, sort of like in a couple of years, they need a lot more of like this institutional attention, like high level awareness, just brand recognition, and so on. But the question is like, what startups can do in all of this,
Mhm,
right? And yeah, quite often, like these days, when I'm talking, especially to maybe like first-time founders who didn't, like who weren't present or like 5 or 10 years ago in the tech ecosystem, they don't want TechCrunch, they want TBPN, or they want something like
mhm.
this. And again, getting on TBPN is, well, you go and look at the caliber of guests they
Yeah.
get each day and sort of like think how difficult that would be. I mean, to their credit, it's like, it's not just about money. It's also just about like very interesting stories, but you need to
Mhm.
have this story first. Otherwise, it's just going to be replaced by somebody who's more notable. So
Yeah.
what I'm saying a lot to like startups these days is that, first of all, you have to look at the entire spectrum. Because I think what a few publications actually did, like for instance, like Fortune, they now I think cover like smaller funding rounds and generally slightly smaller startups. Again, if you're able to tell an interesting story to them, but generally it's about figuring out, why do you do this in the first place? So if you talk to the media, you need to figure out why, and usually it's I don't know, like trying to raise awareness among investors, candidates, or potential customers/partners,
Mhm.
and each of those tasks can probably be like performed better through other means, whether it's just, like trying to grow your own content and maybe like, like posting accessibly on your own platforms, because like a lot of founders want to be famous, but when you talk to them about why it's important, all of them reply, yeah, I don't have time for this.
Yeah. Yeah, no, in terms of what I'm seeing, what you wanna do to kind of put together a pitch is, like, figuring out what is most interesting about you, right? I feel like a lot of startups aren't really thinking about that in the context of what journalists actually wanna write about, right? Like, I hear like, "Oh, well, we raised, X amount." Okay, that's fine, but what does that mean? Like, how do you put it in the context of what their audience wants to learn about? Like, why is it notable that you raised this amount of money? Who did you raise it from? Like, what are you going to be doing with that money? Like, why is it notable that like you raised? Is there like a unique angle to like what you're doing that's not just your pedigree? Because a lot of startups have that nowadays. Whether that's because you worked at a previous startup that was super hot, or you came from a VC or whatever. The other thing to think about is that maybe the raising round isn't the most important thing that you can be talking about, right? Like, are there stats or data that you have internally that's like interesting to like the industry? That you can talk about. Maybe you can go to like trade publications where that matters a lot more because they're actually interested in hearing more about you and the story. And that works twofold because your audience is more likely to be reading those types of publications rather than like a tech publication. Obviously, everybody wants to have a profile written about them because of them raising, but thinking more holistically about the things that you're doing, the things that you're seeing. Oftentimes I'll work with clients that are, we'll obviously pitch for like their their raises, but tie that to like a customer story of like what they're seeing within the world that they're in. And that oftentimes ends up being like more interesting to the journalist than just the raise itself.
Yeah, and like one thing that I've noticed in many of these tech publications is that even if when they're covering like a fundraise, especially if it's on the smaller scale, they don't even like put it in like the first paragraphs. They sometimes push it until the very end, and it's clear
Mhm,
that it was like the original hook that sort of like secured the publication. But it's all
mhm,
about the story of like about why a company actually matters and about what all the interesting things that you're doing. And then like at the very end, they would say, "Oh, the company is also raised like 7 million from like these investors," and
mhm,
like that's it. So yeah, it's just like you have to really think much deeper about the story and then figure out where you could blend it. And sometimes the answer is like you don't really have a good external option in terms of like earned media.
mhm,
So I guess the lesson for like comms professionals is just to think much wider than this and think
mhm,
about all the channels. Again, sort of like the own channels, they are great. They're really hard to grow at first. But I feel like sort of like fresh founders, they do have this advantage about just like if you're just like post excessively about what you're building and sort of like demos
Mhm.
and examples, and of course like different businesses are like it's sometimes harder to present what you're building compared to maybe like if you are in some serious sort of like B2B process, but then you can still find a way and sort of like just like to show what you need to show is just the progress that you are making, the pace,
Mhm.
because this is what allows people to like vouch for you and like support you. Again, if they believe that you deserve more than you have, they'll be sort of like supporting you until you become like too big and annoying.
Yeah. No, but really, I mean, finding that human element is always going to be more interesting anyway, especially for people that know you and want you to succeed, right? So even like the whole concept of building in public, like it's gotten a bad rap because a lot of it is just very like humble braggy, and people don't like that aspect to it, which is why I suggest that you also talk about the negative stuff that happens. It's not always
Hmm.
just good stuff that's happening all the time, right? I mean, taking it back to the tailwind, right? Like that was,
Hmm.
a negative story that ended up being turned into a positive thing because he came out and was like authentically talking about it. And there's a lot of founders that can talk about that, mistakes that they've made, decisions that didn't turn out quite the way they wanted. I mean, I was just talking to a couple clients last week about this whole idea of like, when do you stop a marketing experiment because you've realized that it's not
Hmm.
really converting the way that you wanted to, you know? And I feel like a lot of times companies get stuck in this whole sunk cost process where you feel that because you invested so much time, money, and effort into it, that you have to keep it going. And oftentimes it's better to just shift that, effort into another new marketing experiment in order to see if that is successful. And oftentimes, as soon as you start doing the new thing, you'll get more excited because you're like, oh, this is a new thing. We're trying it out. And it gives it a better shot than something that you've kind of already been plugging away at. That's kind of a little demoralizing because it's not doing as well as you would have hoped. So, these are all things that, can be spoken about on Twitter, on LinkedIn. And that's what I think thought leadership should kind of focus on. And that then helps get that interest from journalists because they're like, oh, you have an interesting story that people want to hear about because you're talking about it here. And we're seeing that you're getting that engagement on your own channels.
Yeah, and like one thing that you just mentioned is that like you need to build like this following internally because it serves essentially as a validation for reporters, and this is definitely true because I feel like from like talking to these people, and like we have a couple like former reporters working on our team, is that the dream of a reporter is to basically find your company at this point of the uplift where nobody knew you before except maybe like your customers, and then suddenly everybody knows you, and they
Mhm.
want to be sort of like the first to tell this story, and your goal is to essentially present yourself as a company that's just about to do this, right? That you have all these social like validation around you, because reporters definitely look at this. I feel like, for instance, like if you remember, like the Arc browser that was like extremely popular until it was like sunset, but I feel like a lot of the attention that it got was because reporters genuinely saw the attention of its users, right? Sort of like all the
Mhm.
interest and like how quickly it was growing and like like spreading even across sort of like normies, like mainstream users, and definitely sort of like not early adopters. So if you're able to build this internally, you will just become more and more interesting to the media, and you would be able to
Mhm.
leverage them to propel yourself even further.
Yeah. Agreed.
The first lesson is that, yeah, if you want to work in comms, I feel like just like you need to focus on a lot more than to like just earned media as it used to be. Just because if you limit yourself to earned media, you will have very few clients, or you will sort of like struggle to get like too many results for your company if you're in house. Because like right now, when we're sort of like about to announce maybe like like a major product or maybe like a new funding round, we of course we do want to land some great like media publication in like tech business or like sort of like other relevant sector. But we also think quite a lot about sort of like all the message that will go into it, about all the launch materials, about sort of like blog posts, LinkedIn and expos for the founders, about all the imagery. It's like why all of these startups wanted to do like sort of like launch videos, right? And it's
Mhm.
probably oversaturated in the market a little bit, but the idea is correct, right? You need to sort of like create something that will serve serve as the artifact for all the other people. It's just like probably at this point, just like doing yet another video probably will not cut it. And
Mhm.
especially if you're like somebody in, like in the US West Coast, it's probably going to be quite expensive for you.
Mhm.
So but there are other things that you could do just in terms of, again, like creating great content that people want to share, that people love to watch. It's about like trying to get anything that attracts attention to your company. And because right now comms is all about owning the story and the distribution and the community, and you need to think about this holistically. And yeah, the
Mhm.
most important notes in terms of the media, I would say, is like it's either individuals, so like these like smallish creators who have their own individual presence, and probably usually like newsletters and podcasts, because they can have an extremely targeted and valuable audience for you. And what's even more important is that they are probably read by all the other reporters that you want to tap into. So
Mhm.
if you're able to get recognized by them, it's going to be very positive for your development in the future. And then there's institutional media, and yeah, sometimes you just might be too early for them, and that's okay. It's just like keep them in your arsenal for the future. Continue thinking about this. Maybe like like ping in reporters sometimes with some of your updates and just like learning what they care about. Because if your company grows enough, suddenly they will put a spotlight into you, and you better be ready.
Yeah, a couple things to add on to that is, making sure that you're staying on top of industry news and trends, what journalists write about that in that space. Because while they may not want to speak about you specifically, you offering yourself as a source for what's happening in the industry could get you a long way. And then that's kind of how you build up a relationship with a journalist, because they now trust that you know what you're talking about. I've done this with a few clients. Having somebody that can speak to what's happening with their perspective can oftentimes be more valuable to the journalist than just like talking about like your latest funding round. So think about that, like how can you put a unique perspective to everything that's like happening in the news. And then the other thing is, when you're researching journalists to pitch them on, it's not just about you and like the story that you're putting out. It's more about what their audience will be eager to read about, right? Because you have to think about it as like you're marketing your story to their audience. And that's like what journalists are looking for, is like, what is going to make my audience actually click on the link, actually open up the story, engage with it, and talk about it online. Okay, let's move on to takeaways for the Project Hail Mary and space segment. People are looking for good stories, wholesome stories that, kind of speak to human innovation and ingenuity. And I think there's a lot of space for tech companies right now, especially to be trying to fill that void. There's so many tech companies that are building really cool products. And I think even within the media themselves, like the whole idea of having like rage bait and like anti-tech sentiment is starting to hit a wall. So if you have that type of tech company that is building really cool products, start using those stories of like what your customers are doing or what innovations you're creating, and start either posting it yourself on your blog or starting to pitch the media a little bit more, so that we have more of those stories coming out.
Like I think you already connected these topics, and yeah, sort of like what's common about like Hail Mary and sort of like what's going on in the media is just people really value authenticity, even if they're
Hmm.
like sometimes it sort of like it takes like it takes a little bit of fakery to get there, because again, like sort of like most founders that I know, they are not really like that vocal. They don't want to like spend their life on Twitter compared to
Yeah.
maybe like some people who can do it organically, right? Or like
Uh-huh.
but it certainly like helps a little bit to like do it strategically, just like spending maybe like 10, 15
Hmm.
minutes a day, just like sharing these little bits and pieces about what you're building and doing. Because at the end of the day, that just like allows people to like like figure out who you are and just
Hmm.
become a little bit familiar, even if they don't know you yet. They start essentially becoming your cheerleaders in the end, especially if they're able to see this takeoff and start like you growing. And I've seen some, like I've been monitoring like some founders who started from the very beginning and just like posting about like their first features, their first users, and sort of like where they're able to get after a couple of years. And it's always exciting.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
My takeaway from Delph is just like there are some industries where you really cannot like move fast and break things. Like there are areas where it's just completely unacceptable, especially if you're dealing with enterprise customers, especially if you're dealing with like security or compliance, because as soon as people stop trusting you, your entire business might be ruined. So you have to be extremely careful about this.
Yeah, my takeaway, don't allow yourself to be the villain in terms of like how you're setting yourself up. The reason why this went so viral is because like they were already acting like the villain on Maine and then this kind of fell into that, trap. And it gave people more of an excuse to dislike the company. This is kind of like what we've been talking about with like Cluely, where it's like when you're kind of setting yourself up to be like a villain in the story, people start rooting against you. And this gives them a reason to kind of just jump on, even if they don't understand what's happening or if they haven't even used you like as a service. I think the pile-on ends up being more brand killing. What you mentioned, Yuri, rebuilding trust is so hard. So like, don't screw your customers, over just
Mhm.
because you want to like make the numbers, look good in your favor. And that's also kind of the takeaway from the Sora thing. Burning bridges is not the way that you want to have partnerships going forward. I think if they had kind of been open about what they were going through and why, I mean, it all makes sense, right? The reason why they're canceling Sora makes sense. It's, I don't think that Disney would have been like, no, we got to keep this going, like we want to make $1 billion investment in a part of the company that's failing, so it all
Mhm.
like could have worked out. But I think their desire to be secretive or to not let things get out of, let the cat out of the bag too soon, made them look bad in the end. So sometimes being more transparent and being more open is the way to go, so that you invite people into the process of a very savvy business decision without getting them to rail against you because, you overhyped the launch in the first place.
Exactly. And I feel like if we're getting like into like sorry and everything because it's sort of like related in terms of just the negativity,
Hmm.
the main rule of communication is that just like look, dance like everybody's watching because anything
Yeah.
that you communicate, even internally, it's going to get public, and
Yeah.
you always have to communicate with that assumption in mind. Maybe like not right now because look, you don't have 3,000 employees, but it could be like a legal discovery like 7 years into the future and like just like ask Meta how that's going for them. So
Yeah. Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's funny because I think the story ended up being more about what they did wrong in terms of the announcement versus the actual announcement itself. But we'll never know, right? Because they went about it the way that they went.
yeah, and if we're talking about like there's the overall state of the media, the real takeaway of all of this is it's just going to get even harder for like comms
Mhm.
people, for like tech companies who want to get attention, who want to get coverage. Attention is like the only finite thing that we will probably have in a couple of years, as or at least like it seems this way. So like everybody will be able to build product, but not everybody will be able to get attention for it. So the only way to work with this is just like looking much wider at the entire spectrum available to you, starting in like internally with essentially what's basically called own media, just like writing your own blog posts, LinkedIn, Twitter accounts, and so on. And like we've seen a lot more companies, I think, doing this way, even when they sort of like have a news event that could go into the media in the first place, just like announce their fundraise on their blog and just maybe like, oh, be glad if anybody covers this. I still think we probably should evaluate all of your chances, but just like limiting yourself to earned media is definitely not an option anymore.
Yeah, agree. Basically, make your own news, and then the news will come to you because they're so interested in like hearing about your story. One of the main reasons why you want to build in public so that you're creating that channel and building that channel up for yourselves already. And then once you get the earned media, you can then promote it a little bit more on your own channel. So it should all just kind of be feeding off each other in order to grow your entire brand and, go from there. But you have to be doing the work of like figuring out where your company fits in to the, mediascape and, the what's trending, what's not, and then finding different stories that might be more interesting or more relevant to journalists than just your raise, which, oftentimes really isn't really that interesting anymore for journalists. So thank you for coming on, Yury. Where can people find you?
Yeah, I think the best option is just my blog at molotsov.me, and you can get to all of the other places from there. And yeah, thank you for having me again.
Yeah, definitely. And then you can follow me at Sonia Bashez everywhere, and then the podcast at Meme Team Pod on YouTube, and then Meme Team Podcast on Spotify and TikTok. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.